Okay, so this week I have been reading the review into the BBC Workplace. Now, if you're unfamiliar with the workplace review that they've undertaken, which they released last month, they looked at the culture of the BBC. More generally of its kind of high profile people, I guess, their talent, which that's how they would call them. And what they found was a minority of people who behave unacceptably and whose behaviour is not addressed. And so the report really kind of focused on these individuals and found that they were kind of dotted across and around the organisation, different functions, different departments, but the culture itself wasn't toxic, and that's something I've talked about in the past. It is possible to have kind of toxic individuals here and there, but that doesn't generally mean that the overall culture is toxic. And so some of the high-profile allegations surrounded people like guys like Hugh Edwards and Jermaine Genus, to name two, but it wasn't limited to those people. It really looked across the organisation. It was kind of a wide-ranging review, specifically aimed at finding those elements within the culture that have a negative impact, not only on the lives of the people working in the BBC, which is principally the main reason that you would do a review, but also the reputation of the organisation as well. Again, something I've written about regularly, talked about regularly, is when you have these toxic elements, it can undermine the very fabric of the organisation and close it off to anybody who's looking to join, and they're the kind of people that you need. Now, in response, the BBC have said that they're going to act immediately, of course. They're implementing a call it out campaign where they're kind of encouraging, I guess, more positive behaviour, which is a good thing, alongside challenging poor conduct, which they're going to do through a refreshed code of conduct, a policy with particular guidance for honour presenters particularly. I guess that's what they've been looking at. But there's one key issue that was brought out time and time again, and it's these grey behaviours. And that's the words that were used, grey behaviours, kind of the definition of what's acceptable and what's not. Because it's very clear in the BBC that some people fell short of that. So that's what I'm going to talk about in today's podcast, because I know that this has relevance to other organisations too. It's not limited just to the BBC. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the world has changed, talk a little bit about what people should be thinking about, and also some of those conversations by the time we get to the end. What are those discussions that you need to have? How do you avoid the situation that the BBC found itself in? So let me start with some quotes from the BBC report to see if these kind of resonate with you. So there is still not a shared understanding of what's acceptable and what is not acceptable behaviour. And this is mainly because of so many shades of grey, behaviours that are close to the line, but not clearly unacceptable. So that's the first quote. Does that ring a bell for you and your organisation? Just close to the line, unacceptable? All right, the next quote. This is from the BBC Culture Review report, and I'll put a link to the report in the show notes. We are in an organisation where the workforce can span across 50 years or more, and the tolerance of acceptability is so different across the generations. The generation's going to talk a little bit about that and the expectations that we have and how things have changed and why they've changed as well. All right, the next quote. The danger is that grey behaviours, there's that phrase again, grey behaviours push the line of what's acceptable, and someone will keep pushing the boundary a little further until the environment becomes overtly hostile. You know that individual, they'll keep saying things. There's kind of a shock factor to it. And they'll keep saying things. And eventually it crosses the line and everybody recoils from it. So those are some, I guess, specific quotes that kind of talk to those grey behaviours that people experience within the BBC. Since 2013, workplace norms have changed significantly. It started after the global financial crisis, but really gathered pace post 2013. Me Too, Black Lives Matter. All of a sudden, we had these movements within our workplaces that raised the discussion of, hey, can't we just be human and civil towards each other? You see it on airplanes, you see it in shops now, a call to treat each other humanely. And with the new generation coming into the workforce, so started a little bit with millennials, but definitely with Gen Z, there has been this, kind of complete shift into what's acceptable and what's not. And many, many people, even millennials, Generation X, have found it really, really difficult. So what do we mean by grey behaviours? What do we mean? Well, we mean things like micromanagement, where a boss needs to be copied into absolutely everything. We're talking about kind of terse, abrupt, rude communication, or email ghosting is considered to be those grey behaviours, where you get people who are just shut down in discussion. So there's really no safety. Ideas may be kind of ridiculed. Or people use aggressive language. So this is what we mean by those grey behaviours that someone finds acceptable, but someone else doesn't find acceptable. Now, as I said, we've seen a big shift and a big change since Generation X. So there was one report that found that 60% of Generation Z employees had encountered kind of microaggressions of these grey behaviours in the last year. So inappropriate emails, unwanted physical contact, and exclusionary behaviour were all prevalent. And these kind of things fall into the grey zone. I knew a story of one organisation I was working with where one older member of staff used to massage people's shoulders, male and female. He didn't discriminate between the genders. And for him, he'd done that for 20 years and he couldn't see that that was completely inappropriate. But then, no one had ever talked to him about it. No one had said, kind of, this is what you do and this is what you don't do. And this was one of the comments in the BBC report. Someone said, I'd love to see a very clear do and don't in terms of what's acceptable, what's not, but also banter. What's cruel and what's offensive. And I've talked about banter before. I've written about it before. Banter is good, providing that it doesn't, kind of demean, embarrass or upset other human beings. And so this is the challenge that we've got. They've got in the BBC right now that they have to address what they've got in organisations as well, and yours might be the same, is we've got these different expectations. Now, of course, Gen Z have got different expectations because they've been brought up differently. Their parents have brought them up to expect more. Not only that, the information that they have available to them, it really influences their thinking, their way of working, their way of being. And this is all good. It's all positive. It all adds to the fabric of the way that we work. Unless you're not from that generation, in which case you can see it as a negative. Oh, it's not like the old days. Oh, you used to be able to say things in the old days. You can't say anything these days. Of course you can. It's just about finding that balance about what's appropriate, what's acceptable, and what's not. And what we don't want is people constantly crossing those boundaries and creating this kind of environment where it's really, really unsafe. Almost subconsciously doing it because no one has told them any different. No one's told them, hey, this is just not what we do anymore. And this is where those grey behaviours come in. Now, we're all susceptible to it, regardless of your age, regardless of your gender. We're all susceptible to it. And it can be solved very, very quickly by having a conversation and then producing some very clear guidelines. Now, often these things are written in kind of really boring process and policy documents. And then what that does is it puts the onus on individuals to report instances of grey behaviour, poor behaviour, and then it relies on managers doing something with that. And that's often where everything breaks down because those things just don't happen. And I'll come in a little minute about what, kind of what we can do to address this. And what we want is discussions. What we want is conversations. What we want is agreement. We want it to be out in the open. We want people to understand that if we're going to change things, if we're going to make it really clear, what we have to do is have the discussions and then we as a team, as individuals, write that down. Now, what we see in the Gallup State of the Workforce report is those organisations that really foster fairness, good behaviour as a component of healthy workplaces, they outperform typical workforces by 83%. 83%. And that's That's the kind of environment where people feel they can bring their best self to work. They're happy in what they do. And of course, what that does then is contribute to productivity, contribute to results. So there's a clear line between making it really clear what's acceptable and what's not, and the results that it actually produces. It's not some kind of, oh, let's just tidy everything up. Oh, wouldn't that be great? I mean, that would be great if we did all that. But actually, there's a direct line between good behavior, agreement on that behavior, and then actually they're kind of and producing the results that we expect. Now, another thing that the BBC are doing is they're kind of developing real-time culture data to kind of track these patterns, and that's all good. But what I would say is people know. And that was certainly the case in the BBC. And, what we saw as a fallout when some of these allegations were brought to the fore, people knew. And it's not just the BBC. When I was writing Detox Your Culture, I wrote about ITV, and they had a similar situation with one of their talent who behaved inappropriately. There wasn't a toxic culture, but obviously they'd acted and behaved in a way that was considered to be grey. And so it's crucially important that those conversations are had, those agreements are made. We can't just assume anymore that people know how to behave. We have to make it really, really clear, and someone said behavior isn't black and white. I disagree. I think that it is black and white when it comes to the workplace. I think if you all want to avoid any impact on individuals, I think if you want to maintain that sense of psychological safety, which is not some buzz phrase, it's the sense that, kind of that people have when they go to work and they feel like they can be the best version of themselves and do their best work. This is what we need we really do need that agreement. We need to promote the right behaviors, but also we need to uphold them too. And so in order to do that, there's a few things that we need to do. Yes, you need the right policies. Yes, you need the right procedures. These are all things that safeguard the organization reputationally, but that's not enough. Leadership teams need to role model the behaviors that they expect of everybody else. Okay, now that's the start point. Because actually, as adults, we still ape what we see. So we're still looking to the people above us and saying, how do they behave? How do they respond? How do they react? I was speaking to someone last week and their CEO kind of was effing and jeffing at an event. And I said, well, how did that go down? And she's like, not very well. It will have done for about 20% of the people who love that kind of language. But for the majority, it will not have gone down well. And that's a clear communication sign. Also, it's considered to be a kind of a microaggression. So we want leaders to set the tone. The next thing is we want managers to have the same skills and the same behavior, but also we want them to be able to call out people who don't demonstrate the behaviors that we're looking for. We want managers to assume that responsibility to have those difficult conversations. Now, often we don't train managers, we don't give them those skills, but we want them to really set the tone. But also we want to train them on how to have the conversation about behaviors within their own teams. Because behavior differs and banter differs between teams. I've talked about this in the past. If you've got a really close, tight group of people who've worked together for a while, then the level of conversation, the level of mickey taking, these kind of things will be completely different if you've got a brand new team, mixed generation team. I work with a group of engineers. They were all Generation X. I've been working together for 5 years. The conversations that they had, there's no way any other team in the organization could have had those, particularly in the way that they did them. They were massively productive. They were hugely proud to work for the organization. None of what they said ever got out into the public and never did it in the public domain. They were a brilliant team to work with, but they knew what was acceptable and what wasn't. And interestingly, for that engineering team, I actually went out on the road with them to do jobs. A more professional group of people I've never worked with. And then when we had lunch together, it was completely different. It was brilliant. It was absolutely brilliant. But I guess the point there is the manager of that team knew what was appropriate for that group, knew how to have those conversations. And if anybody had stepped outside of that, if anyone had demonstrated one of those grey behaviours, they'd have been called to task, taken to task pretty quickly. I think the other thing here for organisations as well is to have some form of whistleblowing, because unfortunately, even though I want to believe that if we give managers the skills, everyone would demonstrate them consistently and everyone would be happy, it doesn't always work that way. So there's got to be a mechanism for staff to report these issues of these grey areas and then the organisation to actually investigate them. Now, you don't have to do a massive investigation that's cost hundreds of thousands of pounds, but you do have to take the allegation seriously and put the right amount of manpower on there. Something else I talked about in Detox Your Culture, just because someone makes an allegation doesn't make it true, but it gives the organisation a signal that they have to conduct an investigation. And it has to be thorough. and it can't be weighted towards people in power. That was another thing that came through in the culture review, the fact that some of these people had a sense of power over others. So they're just some of the things that you can do to get really clear. And I think we're at the stage now within our workplaces where this has to be something that's addressed every year, because our world is changing all of the time. You add politics, you add religion, you add all other kinds of things to our workplace mix. It really does change the dynamic. So we do need to be black and white with regards to behaviours. What we know, not just from this BBC review, but what we know from our workplaces generally, and certainly what I saw when I was writing Detox Your Culture, is when organisations make the space for grey behaviours, people will fill those spaces, they'll exploit them, and the workplace becomes unsafe for everybody.